season were far higher in the point standings than probably they may well have expected, but they committed a lot to make that happen. Final year of the regulations, everything's as mature as it can be. Next year, Haas have still effectively the smallest technical staff of any team. They will take as much as they can from Ferrari, but questions on whether Ferrari are really going to cook that hard. So I think what was great for Behrman is that this most recent season, this may have been his chance to prove himself, right? Because if you're driving around at the back of the grid, doesn't really matter how good you are. If the car is terrible, nobody's really going to care. But for Behrman, he had his chances at the end of last season to really show what he could do in a car that was competent, and he did exactly that. So I think that puts him in good stead, whatever Haas look like next season. We also, though, have to talk about Aston Martin, because over the last few days, they have been the team getting the most attention, and I think understandably so. Questions on whether Leclerc could drive for them, whether Verstappen could drive for them, whether they will sign Gianpiero Lambiase from Red Bull Racing. Now look, signing GP, it doesn't make your driver Max Verstappen, but it may make your driver at the future Max Verstappen if he wants to join. So some big questions on Aramco as well, from an engine fuel provider perspective. We'll discuss a little bit more on that in a second, but I'll just share this little 20-second video that Aston Martin put out with Honda and with Aramco to say, hey, just before the winter shutdown, we fired up the engine for the first time with all the technical staff in attendance. Should we expect Aston Martin to be a serious threat this season? They themselves are, of course, going to be very optimistic. I don't think they're necessarily expecting to win the championship this year, but they will be expecting to be, closer than they have been in this cycle so far. Of course, 2023 was phenomenal, but arguably just because the other teams let the side down compared to the competitiveness of that RB19 that year. Now, there was some rumours the other day around Mike Crack, whether he's still going to be part of Aston Martin at all, whether he's happy with things, whether he's going to be, leave, or whether he's going to be fired or whatever. We know there's been some drama behind the scenes. Adrian Newey certainly has his opinions when it comes to what the team should look like internally, and he calls the shots now. So Andy Cowley's gone into a different role. Mike Crack, we've never really seen from him now in some time since being the team principal. Not that long ago, but apparently before the factory closure on Christmas Eve, he was assigned some long-term tasks, therefore it's likely that he will stay for now. So, of course, you don't want massive internal turmoil. Listening to Newey in the long term may be the right call, but you don't want the team having a bit of a problem internally. The technical staff aren't happy with Newey, whatever, right? You know how things could go. So changing things up internally, but at least keeping things at least not totally chaotic, could well be a good sign. There's also talk, of course, about the fuel. We discussed in recent days what Aramco are doing versus what Petronas are doing with Mercedes. There's also BP. There's ExxonMobil with Red Bull, of course, and then there's Shell with Ferrari. Now, Shell, as we discussed, have been pretty clear they are going down a biofuel route, whereas Aramco and others are going down an e-fuel route. So, e-fuel is just effectively synthetic fuels. Biofuel is using, as you might expect, bio-waste and other materials, and there's no rule exactly on how you have to make the fuel, right? The rule is just it's got to be 100% sustainable, and that's it. Now, as we talked about the other day, the biofuel in the short term is thought to maybe give some advantage because it's well understood how those type of compounds burn, how they behave, how, let's say you can run your engine with that in mind. The e-fuels, these like fully sustainable fuels, they may get there, they may be better, and they may be what the future really looks like in, let's say, the next couple of decades, but they're probably less well understood. That seems to probably be true for the likes of Petronas. They've not really made it clear whether they're going to have like a blend, whether it's going to be fully e-fuel or fully biofuel or whatever, but most of the manufacturers have not really said. Aramco, though, have made it pretty clear they're going synthetic. Shell have made it pretty clear for Ferrari that they are going bio. Now, it's interesting because Aramco have been working on this for some time. If there's any team which is probably best advanced from this perspective, it will be what Aramco are cooking up for Honda and Aston Martin, because they've done this for the junior formulas now for a little while. They probably, the world over, from a technological perspective, have an edge in this regard. Now, if Honda have a good enough engine, that of course is another counterpart, but fuel is a factor this season. There's some talk here from the Italian press that the Arabs will be able to provide Honda with a fuel with a high calorific value, potentially adding a few more horsepower. So, again, there's one thing about having a fuel with more calories, as it's described, with really more energy. It's another thing to be able to extract that energy. So, you know, of course, there's two sides to the story here. But that's the talk anyway, that maybe if the Honda engine isn't as good, in the same way that the Ferrari engine might not be as good, and the Honda, because of this compression ratio trick Mercedes are up to, but if Ferrari's fuel, or if their design, as we talked about yesterday, and certainly if Aston Martin's fuel with Honda and with Aramco is better, then it could make up for some of that deficit in theory. But let's talk about what Newey might be up to here, right? Because there's lots of talk about loads of grey areas, loads of loopholes in these regulations, ideas that are set to be exploited. This may be part of it, right? Because we talked about Ferrari yesterday. They want to run side pods that will create as much outwash as possible. And in order to design the side pods the way they want to have a really small battery. Now, look, the battery is still big. I mean, it's bigger, right? Like, we've got more deployment this season. We've got more energy coming from the hybrid unit. It's, you know, heavier, right? So those are problems that need to be counted for. But the technology is advancing. The teams want it to be as small and as light as possible. But that is obviously a challenge. Wait for the upcoming season. Now, there is another technology here that could be implemented because, again, there aren't any rules when it comes to sustainability for the fuels, for the batteries. Of course, there's plenty of regulations, but within reason, if there's a new technology that teams are developing and coming up with, then they're free to do that outside of the rules, because that's kind of the point of F1, is to push the boundaries on the technology. So currently, all these batteries are lithium ion, right? So you've got a liquid electrolyte, it's moving around lithium ions, it can charge very swiftly, it can critically, really, decharge very swiftly. So if you want to deploy a lot of electrical power, you can do so very rapidly from a lithium ion battery. However, there is an emerging technology here, which is a solid state battery. So instead of using a liquid electrolyte, as my understanding is pretty limited, but it would be a solid state, right? Now, that provides advantages, because if it's solid, you can effectively cram more in to a given area. It can be lighter, it can be smaller, it can potentially have better thermal stability. You're not worried about the the electrolyte catching on fire, right? As can be an issue with lithium ion as it stands. So that's a technology which is emerging, and in coming years it may well be the preferred way to go. The issue with this currently is that while it may charge quickly, actually outputting that energy from a solid state battery is a much bigger challenge than with the current tech. There is talk about potential a hybrid of both, a semi-solid. There was some other talk that, you know, potentially Honda could be bringing a quasi-solid battery, but for next year it's probably a stretch. But over the coming years, the teams that develop the battery tech swiftly, I know that these regulations might not be here for very long, but the teams that push hard on this, they may be better placed. So anyway, there's a little bit of talk about energy density and power density, because the solid state battery in theory would have higher energy density, but in terms of power deployment, which right now is kind of what matters, the lithium ion battery is still preferred. That's that piece of the puzzle. But let's talk about rake, because this is a key conversation for next season and a big question mark right now. In 2025, 24, 23, we roughly know what the teams are going to do, because we've seen them do it in 2022. But in 22, we saw all sorts of ideas, right? It was really the side pods, right? Mercedes had a very different approach with the zero pods to what Ferrari had, which was the complete opposite. Red Bull somewhere in the middle, but with a massive undercut. That became the standard, and Adrian Newey, of course, was the designer of that car. But rake, if you guys are relatively new to the sport, is what this refers to. So pre-2022, rake was a very commonly deployed technique, really, of generating more performance on the cars. Now, there are pros and cons to both approaches, but Red Bull historically ran a very high rake concept, and the Mercedes you wouldn't really notice it much on, with a far lower rake, but the Red Bull was very clearly raised heavily at the rear compared to at the nose. That is what rake refers to in Formula 1, and in the Venturi tunnel era that we've had for the last few years, it's not been relevant, because if you want to make sure the floor is sealed, if you want to generate as much downforce from those Venturi tunnels, you've got to run the car flat and low to the ground. But the Venturi tunnels are now gone. Things are changing radically. The floor will still generate some downforce via ground effect. The floor has always generated some downforce. The teams will always find a way. But in 2021, let's say, and in that era, it was possible to do so, but also run some rake to gain other benefits. So the primary advantage of running rake is that you can see the angle here is so dramatic. It helps channel more air, more energized air, up into that diffuser at the back of the car. So you can effectively generate more performance out of the diffuser without actually doing anything. Now, it has other benefits in terms of the suction that can be generated from the underfloor as well. Again, if you've got Venturi tunnels and you're in a ground effect era of regulations, then that doesn't really apply anymore. And for 2026, I don't expect to see rake on this level returning. I doubt it, but maybe it's not totally impossible. There's also the benefit of, if you run the car with this level of rake, it tends to make the car pretty pointy, and on the front end you tend to get a very sharp response to the front end, something Max Verstappen very much enjoys. But it does have downsides, right? Let's say the pitch sensitivity, the suspension design becomes incredibly important. Getting the performance out of that kind of concept and not stalling the diffuser is a big challenge. So there were trade-offs here, and as we know, Red Bull tended to go for it. Mercedes tended not to. The other advantage of lower rake is less drag, because if you're raising the rear ride height of the car, then you're going to just naturally have more drag from this type of design. But then when you get to top speeds, the downforce is going to compress the back of the car with the rear wing, so maybe it's not too much of a big deal. Anyway, Newey loves running his cars with a fair bit of rake. I mean, you can see here just how far that diffuser is off the ground compared to how it has been in the most recent generation of cars. So, is rake coming back? That's the big theory. So some rumours coming out of the Spanish press. Again, it's just interesting to keep in mind, because Spanish press, you might think, well, Sainz, maybe Alonso, is there some connection there? Possibly, possibly not. But there seems to be a suggestion that rake could be back, and potentially could be back with Aston Martin and Adrian Newey. But simultaneously, the Italian press is suggesting that there probably won't be any rake in the cars. So who's right on this one? And that is, again, the big question, because going into next year, so many grey areas, so many loopholes. Who knows what these guys are going to come up with? But I find the idea that rake could be back is pretty fascinating. I'm not expecting, 2020 levels of rake or anything in that kind of era. But certainly it's possible that we get something from some teams. So the Italian press say that if you were to run rake, you wouldn't be able to seal the floor effectively. There's still downforce to be generated there. You would effectively ruin the performance of the diffuser, which is kind of the whole point in doing this in the first place. But there are other reports that actually know there will be some rake back, and potentially Adrian Newey could be getting involved. So this is very fascinating. Again, both concepts, as we saw in 2021, right? You have the high rake Red Bull, you have the low rake Mercedes. Both cars were fantastic and delivered a phenomenal season. So it's not like one is necessarily better, but we know the way that Newey likes to design his cars, and if he can put some rake in the car, he will probably try. And it's pretty fascinating to think what that could look like, because if the Italian press is saying this ain't gonna work, tells me Ferrari ain't doing it, right? So, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, it might be the right call. You've got to take some risk for the next season. Maybe you think with Aston Martin there's a way here to gain more performance by doing so, or maybe just create a design which is more, let's say, evolutionarily viable, right? Because Ferrari suffered in 2022. They bought these beautiful voluptuous side pods, and that was a great design and it worked, but they realised that there wasn't enough development potential in that concept, and they had to switch to what Red Bull was doing. So maybe there's something about that for Newey as well, that maybe Aston Martin will not exactly come out of the gates with the fastest car, but they may come out of the gates with a car which is better positioned for development over the next couple of years than some of their rivals do. But the reality is that